If you were ever unpleasantly surprised when you saw your yearly tax bill and thought about potential ways to lower or eliminate a huge tax bill, you probably thought in one shape or form about leaving your home country physically and financially. However, when you think about that, there are many unknowns, and if you do not put all of your ducks in a row before deciding on and executing something like that, you generally may receive even more unpleasant surprises along the way when the process is already in motion. Here today, we will be talking about the basics of becoming a Canadian tax non-resident and what you should pay attention to. My name is Jelena. I'm a strategy manager here at Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs go where they're treated best. When talking about tax non-residents in Canada, there are certain rules that will apply to the majority of the leavers, as we will call them in this video. And then there are some rules that are applicable on a case-to-case basis. So remember to always consult with an expert before diving into something such as a tax non-residence process, especially if you have a more complex structure with trusts and companies involved. Now today we will be focusing on the personal tax non-residency, and in our other video we'll be focused on trusts and companies. Now, the first misconception to dispel is that your tax residency generally has little or nothing to do with your immigration status. So that means that you can be a citizen of another country and a non-citizen of Canada and still be considered a tax resident of Canada. In the same way, you can be a citizen or a permanent resident of Canada without being a tax resident of Canada. So, as you can see, tax residency generally can be a complicated issue, and determining it is not always straightforward. Now, from the point of view of the Canadian Revenue Agency, or the CRA, residency is generally based on a range of possible factors. And some of the things that the CRA will take into consideration and that they want to see is, number one, they want to see that Canada is not your home. So while you can generally retain your Canadian citizenship and you can return for visits, you should generally effectively be kind of a tourist on any return visits to Canada, at least if or until you decide to return full-time to Canada. The second thing that the CRA wants to see is that you have a home somewhere else. So you should generally aim towards demonstrating ties to another country, such as a residence permit, driver's license, social memberships, bank accounts, and similar. Now, do take into consideration that being a resident in a foreign country does not mean that you will be a tax resident or incur a tax obligation there immediately. The third option that Canada wants to see is that you're departing permanently. So your departure from Canada should be considered permanent. So that means that you should not leave behind any ties that may indicate that you may return to Canada in the future. The fourth test that the CRA looks at is the days test or the physical presence test. So if you spend 183 days in Canada, you will be a tax resident by default. However, the vice versa is not necessarily true. A Canadian who spends 182 days or fewer in Canada is not always going to be considered a tax non-resident. To become a tax non-resident, you must demonstrate the intent to permanently leave Canada. Now, this does not mean that you can never return. You are free to change your mind later, but your intent at the time of departure should be of permanent nature and should not be considered something as a gap year or a vacation. Now, one of the most important things is to cut ties with Canada, which means that, number one, your immediate family should preferably move abroad with you. Second, you should not have a home available to you in Canada. So that means that if you have a home there, you should rent it out or sell it. You should also not use your Canadian banks on a daily basis and should preferably close them. So there are a number of factors that should be taken into consideration when showing intent, as that can be seen as something subjective. And you should preferably aim towards establishing a connection with another country to have a solid case. Now, once you leave Canada, you can try and self-assess your tax residency, especially if the situation seems to be straightforward. But if there's any uncertainty, the matter will not be settled until the CRA gives its determination, which you can generally apply for through a special form called NR73. Now, once you are certain that you are becoming or have already become a non-resident of Canada for tax purposes, it is going to be time to consider your new tax obligations. So when leaving Canada, And when it comes to your Canadian tax obligations in the year of departure, there are essentially three possibilities for any given tax year. The first possibility is that you can be a tax resident for the full year, which means that your home and your tax home is in Canada. The second option is that you can be a tax non-resident, which means that your tax home and all of your ties are in another country and not in Canada. Or you can be a part-year tax resident, which means that you were a tax non-resident for part of the year and you were a tax resident for the other part of the year. This is the most common option when somebody moves away from Canada at some point during the year. Unless you leave Canada at exactly midnight on December 31st, you will probably have to file a part-year resident return to cover the last days, weeks, or months during which you are considered to be a tax resident of Canada. Now, this return is essentially the same as a regular resident tax return with a few tweaks that your CPA can generally help you with. Now comes the most important part, and that is the departure tax or exit tax upon leaving Canada for tax purposes. If you thought that Canada will simply let you leave with all of your assets, unrealized gains, and potential future gains your assets can bring, you are generally very wrong. When you leave Canada, the government considers you to have sold certain types of assets, even if you have not actually sold them, at their fair market value, and to have immediately reacquired them for the same amount. Now, this is called a deemed disposition, and you may have to generally report any capital gain that may arise from that disposition. Now, even if this happens and you have some capital gains tax to pay, it is important to know that only 50% of the total gain is considered taxable in Canada. So the taxable gain will be taxed at your marginal tax rate. So this will be a part of your regular income tax return. It's not a special filing. There's not a special form to fill for this. Now, when departing Canada, you are required to provide a list of all of your assets at that time of departing that have a total fair market value of over 25,000 Canadian dollars. However, there are a couple of exceptions. So first of all, it's cash. If you have cash on hand, you can simply move it with you out of Canada, no reporting requirements. Pension plans, annuities are also not subject to reporting or deemed disposition, RRSPs, TFSAs, and Canadian real estate. Now, Canadian real estate is generally not subject to the deemed disposition. Instead, the sale of that property will be reportable at the time of the actual disposition. If you sell or rent your Canadian property, you may also be subject to withholding tax as a non-resident. However, in the case of rental income, you may be able to reclaim some of the tax that is withheld. However, this is definitely something that we would tell you to discuss with your tax advisor. Now, these were some of the rules that were applicable to personal tax and residency and what you should look out for if you're deciding to depart Canada for personal tax purposes. However, if your situation is a bit more complex and you have a trust or multiple trusts or companies in Canada that you want to either move abroad, wind up, or leave in Canada, there are many things to be taken into consideration there, and this is where we would definitely recommend consulting with an expert for your particular situation. Now, if you want to learn more about this, then stay tuned and look out for our next video that will be talking about trusts and companies in Canada and how to depart while having those entities. Or if you want to learn more about that and work with us, you can simply apply to work with us on our application on our website.